I've been working since I was 14 years old. Recently, I've been thinking about what that means. And I've been asking myself questions like, why did I start so young? Did I really have to? And what effect does that have on my life today? And that led me to another set of questions, like the environment that I grew up in. You know, the American mindset, how we define success and how we think we can achieve success. And then I thought, hustle culture. Now, I can't sit here and say that hustle culture is exclusively American, but it's definitely one of the countries in the world where it's very normalized. Of course, we all have to work to eat and pay our bills, even though today more and more people are struggling to do that. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about hustle culture specifically. The one that tells us that there's always more to strive for. You know, we're all after the bigger money, we're all after that promotion, and today it even translates into more views. That train of thought that teaches us that in order to achieve anything meaningful, we have to put in the work. We've all heard someone say, while you sleep, your competitor is working hard. And I've definitely been through this phase multiple times. And that led me to ask myself, well, how did it all start? And that's what I'm here to talk about today. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I was born and raised in New York City by Colombian parents, but I have been living in Medellín since 2018. I am a tour guide here, so if you're planning on visiting Colombia or Medellín, I have left all of the information in the description of this video. I also make content regarding my life as an expat in Colombia and things first generation American. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can consider subscribing. All right, so let's get back to the topic. So I think that in the US, we learned from very early on the relationship between labor in exchange for money. And in many households, this idea starts with an allowance. Maybe when kids in the US are 7 or 8 years old, they get some money from their parents in exchange for household chores, like taking out the trash, washing the dishes, doing their laundry or folding their clothes, keeping their bedroom organized, and it could sometimes translate into getting good grades in school. And kids usually use that money to buy snacks after school or use it at the book fair or to buy gifts for the family during the holiday. Sometimes they're saving the money to buy something that they've been wanting for a really long time. So this particular model that I just described did not apply to me. I got a house, food, clothes, and good music in exchange for all of the chores that I just mentioned. So up until the age of 14, if I ever wanted something, I would just ask my parents for it. And that's like the first example that comes to mind about how this like hustle culture, work mindset begins. And then I remembered programs like Bring Your Kid to Work Day. We all know what Bring Your Kids to Work Day is. It's basically one day of the year where you follow your parents at their job. You get to see what they do, and the idea is that it should incentivize children to prepare for the future and understand what it takes to make money. That particular program, I think, targets children between the ages of 8 and 18. And the other big one is summer youth employment programs, which is designed to offer preteens and teenagers starting at the age of 14 employment opportunities during their time off. Typical jobs include positions at summer camps, beaches, pools, and customer service. You know, things like that. And they usually pay whatever the state's minimum hourly wage is. So the idea of these programs is to keep kids busy during their time off and at the same time train their soft skills like punctuality, following instructions, respecting hierarchies, teamwork, and developing communication skills. So this working mentality is ingrained in us since we are kids. And of course, I participated in all of this. My first job was when I was 14. My cousin was the maitre d' at a very fancy white tablecloth restaurant restaurant on Park Avenue, and he hired me to be the lunch hostess and a receptionist during my time off and during my summer vacations. And I also did a lot of retail, fast food, and call centers throughout the years. And I remember feeling very proud about making my own money at such a young age. It gave me a sense of independence. I didn't have to wait around or beg my parents to get me things that I wanted. And I also remember that this self-sufficiency was praised amongst the adults, even though I was just a kid. So I don't necessarily think that the system is 100% evil. I think that those opportunities definitely helped me hone in on some very important skills in life, but they have definitely left some things that are not so cool. And one of those things is actually feeling guilty about taking time off and realizing the importance of rest. I think that for most of us children of immigrants, we grew up watching our parents hustle all the time. And that somehow registered in us. And we grew up thinking that taking some time off, enjoying ourselves, is a waste of time. And I don't know how healthy that is. And of course, it's easier for me to notice these patterns about myself because I live in such a contrasting culture from what I grew up in. And that brings me to the next idea, and it's that a lot of people that live in developed countries, particularly first generation Americans, second generation Americans, think that the people in Latin America are lazy or that they just don't work as hard as they do. And I think that that idea is a result of thinking that the way that we do things is the right way and the only way to get things done. You know, we watch our parents work very hard in many occasions, multiple jobs. They are sacrificing a lot to make it work for them and their families in the US. And somehow, some way, that becomes the reference point of what hard work looks like. And I think that that has many repercussions, including the way that we look at Latin America. You know, sometimes we can look at our relatives that live back home, and since they're not working the multiple jobs, since they're not on that 24-hour hustle, we interpret that as them not working hard enough. And I think that we're not getting the full picture. I can tell you for sure that hustle culture is not as prevalent in Colombia as it is in the United States. And there's many reasons for that. For starters, people aren't constantly driven to consume. There aren't as many billboards or advertisements as you would see in perhaps a place like New York City. So I know for sure that when I go back to New York, I'm often like lured by the attractive advertising, the attractive billboards. I'm constantly enticed to buy something. I want that new iPhone. I want that new MacBook. I want those Jordans. And what do people have to do in order to get those things? We have to work. Of course, there are billboards and advertisements in Colombia, but I've noticed that they are very different than in the US. So for example, the billboards in Colombia will usually advertise a cell phone service provider or some financial service product or some education service. A lot of concerts, a lot of comedy shows are being advertised. Definitely not any luxurious Colombian brands or international brands. Maybe there are, but they are reserved for very exclusive areas. But even in the exclusive areas, you're not constantly bombarded by the advertising. So you're not constantly being reminded of what you don't need. And of course, the job market operates completely different in Colombia. For starters, they aren't pushing Bring Your Kids to Work Day or summer youth employment programs out here. Jobs that are typically done by teenagers or college students in the US are performed by full-grown adults in Colombia. Students are busy being students. They aren't in this immediate rush to become independent. And families are also encouraging their students to formalize their education in order to improve their chances at getting the best job available for them. And I think that that speaks to a lot of things. The job market in Colombia isn't that robust. There aren't a lot of local opportunities for people. In order to get a startup here, it takes very long, the process is very frustrating, and things become very complicated. And also, the tax system in Colombia doesn't help very much. I also think that a lot of the opportunities that are available here depends a lot on who you know, even more so than in the US. And so this is why I think that family is the pinnacle of Colombian culture, because they're not only the emotional support, they're the financial support as well. In Colombia, especially in Medellín and in the surrounding areas, Sundays look a lot like what our Thanksgivings look like once a year. Family is very important. I've also had the opportunity to work in 3 big Colombian corporations, so I was able to analyze how these companies are staffed. And for the most part, a lot of them are career employees. Once they enter the companies, they stay until retirement. And they are okay with waiting their turn to get that promotion. There isn't this big turnover that you might see in the US. Maybe things are changing now with the availability of remote international work, but for the most part, if a person in Colombia enters one of these big corporations, they tend to stay for the long run. The productivity culture in Colombia isn't so gung-ho. They aren't looking to fill every available moment with productivity, even in lower income households. So the general culture in Colombia is to have one job and the rest of the time you spend it with your family. And I don't necessarily think that that's being lazy. I think that that's just the culture here. I mean, I don't know. I didn't grow up in the Colombian system. I'm just making observations between myself and my environment. I definitely admire the value that Colombians place on interpersonal relationship and how they choose to spend their time off. They're not focused on making everything about production. And that is so important. That's one of the things that I've enjoyed and I've had to learn how to do, because it doesn't come easy, especially when you're programmed to make every moment count. Now, it's obviously not the perfect system, because if it were the perfect system, then not a lot of Colombians would have the desire to migrate to developed countries. But anyway, that is just my idea for today. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and I'm curious about how you guys feel, what you guys think. I'd love to read you in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. I'll see you in the next one.